30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean Delta. Flight 473 cruised through the night sky. The cabin lights were dimmed. Most passengers dozed beneath thin blue blankets or stared at flickering screens. In row 10 seat, a Colonel James Maverick Sullivan jerked awake with a pam that nobody heard. His knuckles whitened around the armrests. Sweat beaded on his forehead. The nightmare again. Always the same one, MiG-29 screaming through the sky, radio chatter fragmented by static. "Bandit on your 6, Phoenix 2. The young lieutenant's voice crackling with fear. A missile launch, a fireball blooming against the desert sky. His own voice making the impossible call, "Continue mission, we push forward." James exhaled slowly, forcing his fingers to release their death grip. 57 years old now, hair more salt than pepper, but still carrying himself with military precision. 25 years since Desert Storm. 14 years into civilian life. Yet the dreams persisted with brutal clarity. He glanced at his watch, 3:17 a.m. 6 more hours until London. 6 more hours until he would face them all again at the NATO conference. The survivors, the families. 25 years since Operation Blackwing. Beside him in seat B, an older man stirred. Lieutenant Colonel William Bill Harrison, 65, with weathered skin that told stories of high-altitude flights and countless missions. He'd been James's flight instructor, then squadron commander, then friend. A Cold War veteran who'd flown SR-71 Blackbirds on reconnaissance missions over Soviet territory when tensions ran highest. "Still having those dreams, Maverick?" Bill asked quietly, his voice a low rumble that wouldn't disturb nearby passengers. James nodded once. "Always before anniversaries." "The Davis boy?" Another nod. Lieutenant Robert Davis, 26 years old, newly married, first child on the way, the one James had sacrificed to complete the mission. "You made the only call you could," Bill said, not for the first time in 25 years. "Saved hundreds of our boys on the ground." "I know," James replied. He always said he knew. Sometimes he even believed it. The mission had been classified for years. Operation Blackwing, January 17, 1991. 4 F-16s sent deep into Iraqi territory to take out a previously unknown anti-aircraft installation that was decimating Allied air forces. A simple mission that went sideways when they were ambushed by MiG-29s. Lieutenant Davis's plane hit. The impossible choice: abort the mission to save one pilot or press on to destroy the installation that would continue killing Allied airmen by the dozens. James had made the call. They completed the mission. Davis didn't make it home. The mission was declassified 10 years ago, heralded as a turning point in the air campaign. James received commendations medals. Cold comfort for the weight he carried. A gentle chime sounded, and the fastened seatbelt sign illuminated. The plane gave a slight shudder. "Looks like we're hitting some weather," Bill remarked, peering out at the darkness beyond the window. James felt the subtle changes in the aircraft's movement, the minute adjustments, as the pilots navigated growing turbulence. Old habits from thousands of hours in the cockpit. He could feel a plane's behavior the way most men could feel a car's handling. "Captain says we're experiencing some turbulence," a flight attendant announced over the intercom. "Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Behind James in row 11, a young woman looked up from her tablet, Emily Davis, 29, with her father's determined jawline and sharp blue eyes. She didn't know who James was. Didn't know he was the man who had made the call that orphaned her before she was born. She was a brilliant aerospace engineer now. According to the conference attendee list James had studied meticulously before boarding. He'd recognized her name immediately, had almost changed his flight. But running from the past never worked. He'd learned that lesson too many times. The plane shuddered again, more violently this time. Overhead bins rattled. A few passengers murmured in concern. "That's not standard turbulence," Bill said, his voice dropping lower. James nodded. 35 years as a pilot had taught him to feel the difference between routine weather and something more concerning. The plane's vibrations had an irregular pattern. The yaw wasn't right. In the cockpit, Captain John Reynolds, 58, former Navy pilot with over 20,000 flight hours, frowned at his instruments. First Officer Michael Chen, 34, did the same. Something wasn't adding up. "Weather radar shows we're entering a multi-layered system," Chen reported. "Unusual formation. I've never seen patterns quite like this." Reynolds nodded grimly. "Neither have I. Atlantic multi-layer storm. I've read about them, but they're extremely rare. Like flying through multiple weather fronts stacked on top of each other. As if confirming his assessment, the plane dropped suddenly, then bucked upward. In the cabin, a few passengers gasped. A child began to cry. Hydraulic pressure dropping on System 3. Chen announced, his voice remaining professional despite the concern in his eyes. Reynolds keyed his radio. Atlanta Control Delta 473. We're experiencing unusual weather patterns and have a hydraulic anomaly, requesting deviation to heading 030 to avoid the worst of the system. The radio crackled. Static overwhelmed the response. Atlanta Control Delta 473. Did you copy our request for deviation? Reynolds repeated. More static, then silence. Comm systems degrading, Chen reported. Backup radio also showing interference. Reynolds' jaw tightened. Check the passenger manifest. Any air marshals or medical personnel on board? Chen skimmed through the digital manifest. 2 air marshals, 3 medical doctors, and... His eyebrows rose. We have some military personnel. 2 Air Force colonels, Sullivan and Harrison, both retired. Sullivan logged over 5,000 hours in F-16s. Harrison was an SR-71 pilot. Reynolds nodded. Make note of their seat numbers. If this situation deteriorates, having experienced military pilots could be valuable. The plane jolted again, harder this time. Warning lights flashed on the instrument panel. Electrical system showing anomalies. Chen reported, his fingers flying across the controls. Multiple systems flickering. This doesn't match any failure mode in the manual. Reynolds' eyes narrowed. Run a diagnostic on the flight management computer. This doesn't feel right. Chen typed commands into the system. His face paled. Captain, there's unknown code running in the background of the flight management system. What kind of code? Reynolds demanded. I don't know. It's not part of the standard software package. Sir, I think someone might have hacked our systems. Reynolds stared at him. That's not possible. These systems are isolated, secure. I'm just telling you what I'm seeing, Chen insisted. There are processes running that shouldn't be there. And look at these pattern anomalies in the electrical system. This isn't random failure. Reynolds' mind raced. The Boeing 777-300ER was one of the most sophisticated and secure aircraft in existence. But nothing was truly unhackable, was it? Not anymore. He remembered the passenger manifest. NATO conference attendees, including a missile defense expert and documents detailing a new defensive shield system. High-value targets. Run every security protocol we have, Reynolds ordered. I want all systems isolated and running on backups where possible. The plane lurched violently. A loud bang echoed through the aircraft. Warning alarms blared. Hydraulic system 1 failure, Chen shouted. Backup engaging. Reynolds fought with the controls as the aircraft bucked and rolled. Mayday, 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 Delta 473 declaring emergency. Multiple system failures. Position. He glanced at the GPS readout, but the numbers were fluctuating wildly. Position uncertain due to navigation failure. Heading approximately 060, altitude 31,000 feet and maintaining. In the cabin, oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. Passengers screamed. Flight attendants rushed to assist the elderly and children. First Officer Chen suddenly slumped forward, his head striking the control panel. Mike! Reynolds reached over, pulling his co-pilot back. A gash on Chen's forehead was bleeding profusely. He was unconscious. The violent turbulence must have thrown him against the panel. Reynolds was alone now, fighting a crippled aircraft through impossible weather with systems failing inexplicably and no co-pilot. He reached for the cabin intercom. This is your captain speaking, he said, working to keep his voice steady. We are experiencing severe turbulence and some system anomalies. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened and oxygen masks on. Cabin crew, secure the cabin and prepare for emergency procedures. He paused, considering his next words carefully. Then, if there are any military pilots on board, particularly anyone with a Boeing 777 experience, please identify yourselves to the cabin crew immediately. In row 10, James and Bill exchanged glances. That's not a routine announcement, Bill said quietly. James nodded, already unbuckling his seatbelt. No, it's not. Behind them, Emily Davis watched the older man stand. Something about his movements seemed familiar, precise, disciplined, military bearing. The way her father moved in the few videos her mother had kept. As James stepped into the aisle, the plane rolled violently to starboard. He grabbed the seats to stay upright. Years of pilot training kept his balance where others would have fallen. A flight attendant approached, her face pale but professional. "Sir, are you a pilot?" James nodded. "Colonel James Sullivan, United States Air Force, retired. This is Lieutenant Colonel William Harrison, also retired Air Force." "Please come with me," she said, relief washing over her face. As they moved toward the cockpit, Bill leaned closer to James. "I've got a bad feeling about this Maverick. That announcement wasn't just about turbulence." "I know," James replied. "Something's wrong with this aircraft. I can feel it." The flight attendant knocked on the cockpit door in a specific pattern. After a moment, it opened. Captain Reynolds looked back at them, one hand still on the controls. His face was tense, a small cut above his eye, where his headset had struck him during the turbulence. "Gentlemen," he said, "I appreciate you coming forward. As you can see, my first officer is incapacitated." First Officer Chen lay strapped in his seat, an oxygen mask over his face, a makeshift bandage on his forehead. "I'm Captain John Reynolds, former Navy FA-18s before commercial aviation." "James Sullivan," James replied, surveying the cockpit with a practiced eye. "F-16 is call sign Maverick." "Bill Harrison," Bill added. "SR-71s and various other toys during the Cold War." Reynolds nodded. "We have multiple system failures that don't match any normal pattern. Hydraulics compromised. Navigation systems giving conflicting information. Communications intermittent at best." He hesitated. "And we may have a cyber intrusion in the flight management system." James and Bill exchanged looks. "Cyber intrusion," Bill repeated. "On an isolated aircraft system." "Precisely why I'm concerned," Reynolds confirmed. "It shouldn't be possible. Yet we're seeing code executing that isn't part of the standard software package." James scanned the instrument panels, quickly absorbing the information. 20 years in the Air Force had taught him to assess situations rapidly. What he saw troubled him deeply. "This is deliberate," he said quietly. Reynolds nodded. "That's my assessment as well," which raises the question why Bill had moved to the co-pilot station, checking First Officer Chen's vital signs while examining the navigation systems. "He's stable," Bill reported, "but he won't be flying anytime soon." He pointed to the navigation display. "These position jumps aren't random. They're cycling through a specific pattern, almost like a jamming sequence," James finished. "Soviet-style GPS countermeasures. Updated for modern systems." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "You've seen this before." "Similar patterns," James confirmed. "During the Gulf War, Iraqi forces tried to jam our guidance systems using technology they'd acquired from the Soviets. Didn't work well against our military systems, but a civilian aircraft would be more vulnerable," Reynolds concluded grimly. The plane shuddered violently. Warning alarms blared as the aircraft rolled right. Reynolds fought the controls muscles straining. "Right engine power fluctuating," he reported through gritted teeth. "Manual control response sluggish." James moved behind him, eyes darting across the instrument panels. "Fuel imbalance. Right wing tanks showing rapid depletion." "Leak?" Reynolds asked. "Or deliberate dumping," James suggested. "System could be compromised." Bill had pulled up the electrical schematics on the co-pilot's display. "Multiple circuit breakers tripping and resetting. That's not electrical failure. That's intentional cycling." The three men looked at each other, the same realization dawning. "Someone's trying to bring down this plane," Reynolds said, voicing what they all thought. "Question is from where?" Bill replied. "Remote hack or someone on board." James's mind raced. A NATO conference in London. Military officials, defense contractors, security experts, including a missile defense specialist carrying classified documents about a new shield system. "Either way, we need to regain control," James said decisively. "Captain, what's our fuel situation if we discount the right-wing readings as potentially compromised?" Reynolds checked the gauges. "If left-wing tanks are accurate, we have approximately 3 hours of flight time remaining. Nearest diversion airport with suitable runway length would be Keflavik, Iceland, about 2 hours away if we maintain current speed." "If we can maintain current speed," Bill noted grimly. "With these system failures, that's a big if." The plane bucked again. Another warning light flashed on the panel. "Hydraulic system 2 pressure dropping," Reynolds reported. "We're down to the standby system only." James took a deep breath. It had been years since he'd flown anything larger than a Cessna for pleasure, decades since his last emergency situation. But the training never left you. The instincts remained. Captain, I think we need to consider the possibility that this is a targeted attack, he said, maybe related to the NATO conference passengers. Reynolds nodded grimly. I was thinking the same thing. I suggest one of us returns to the cabin, Bill said. Check for suspicious activity. Maybe find that missile defense expert, make sure he and his documents are secure. Agreed, James replied. Bill, you are better with these electronic systems. Stay here, help the captain isolate critical systems and identify the intrusion patterns. I'll check the cabin. Before Bill could respond, the interphone buzzed. Reynolds answered. Captain, this is Stephanie from the main cabin. A flight attendant's voice came through, tension evident in her tone. We have a situation. A passenger attempted to access the forward equipment bay. When confronted, he assaulted Ms. Davis in row 11, who intervened. 2 air marshals have him restrained, but he had some kind of electronic device. Reynolds looked at James. Ms. Davis in row 11, is that? Emily Davis, James confirmed, his throat tightening. Robert Davis's daughter. The name hung in the air between them. Reynolds' eyes widened slightly with recognition. Every military pilot knew about Operation Blackwing, about the impossible choice that Colonel James Sullivan had made. Sir, Stephanie continued over the interphone, Ms. Davis said to tell you she believes the device is transmitting on frequencies that could interfere with aircraft systems. She's an aerospace engineer with cybersecurity clearance. James closed his eyes briefly. Of course she was. Robert Davis's daughter would be exceptional, would be brave enough to confront a suspicious passenger, would have the technical knowledge to recognize a threat. Tell her to bring the device to the cockpit, James instructed, with air marshal escort. As Reynolds relayed the instructions, Bill gave James a knowing look. Davis, that can't be coincidence. No, James agreed quietly. Life doesn't work that way. The plane shuddered again, more violently than before. The right engine's pitch changed audibly even through the cockpit's insulation. Right engine losing power, Reynolds reported. 30% thrust and declining. James made a swift decision. Captain, I suggest you let me take the controls while you coordinate our emergency response. Colonel Harrison can work on isolating the compromised systems. Reynolds hesitated only briefly before nodding. Take the right seat, Colonel. James slid into the co-pilot's position as Bill moved to the systems panel behind them. It had been years since James had touched the controls of an aircraft this size, but the fundamentals never changed. Stick and rudder, thrust and drag. The basic physics of flight remained constant, whether you were piloting an F-16 or a commercial airliner. His hands wrapped around the control column. Muscle memory returned instantly. The feel of an aircraft fighting against atmospheric forces. The subtle vibrations that told a pilot more than any instrument could. I have control, James announced using the standard pilot protocol. You have control, Reynolds confirmed, releasing his grip. The Boeing 777 bucked like a wild horse, but James held firm. Decades of flying fighter jets through extreme conditions had prepared him for this. He adjusted the rudder trim, compensating for the failing right engine. His eyes scanned the instrument panel, prioritizing critical information while filtering out distractions. A knock at the cockpit door. Reynolds checked the security camera, then opened it. Emily Davis stepped inside, escorted by a grim-faced air marshal. In her hands, wrapped in a plastic air sickness bag, was a small black device with blinking lights. Signal jammer, she explained without preamble. Military grade but modified. It's broadcasting across multiple frequencies used by aircraft systems. James glanced at her briefly. Her father's eyes stared back at him, the same determined set to her jaw. He quickly looked away, focusing on the controls. Can you disable it? Bill asked. Not safely, Emily replied. It might have anti-tampering measures, but I can shield it. She held up the air sickness bag. This has a metallic lining that's already attenuating the signal somewhat. We need better shielding, Bill said. Something that can block all electromagnetic emissions. The oven in the galley, Reynolds suggested, is basically a Faraday cage. Emily nodded. Good idea. As she turned to leave, James called out, Ms. Davis? She paused, looking at him curiously. Thank you, he said simply. Something in his tone made her study his face more closely. Have we met before, Colonel? Sullivan, he supplied. James Sullivan, And no, we haven't met. A moment of silence stretched between them. There was a flicker of something in her eyes. Recognition, suspicion. But the moment passed. Get that device contained, Reynolds instructed the air marshal, and find out everything you can from the suspect. As Emily and the air marshal left, Bill moved closer to James. She's going to figure it out, he said quietly. Smart girl like that. Davis's daughter. I know, James replied, making a minute adjustment to compensate for another roll tendency. But right now we have bigger problems. The right engine's power continued to decline. The hydraulic pressure in the standby system was holding but barely. Navigation systems still showed erratic position data, and now they knew it wasn't just system failure. It was deliberate sabotage. Declaring emergency, Reynolds announced, keying the radio. Mayday, 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 Delta 473, multiple system failures. Possible security threat on board. Request immediate clearance to Keflavik International. Approximately 240 souls on board. Static answered him. The communications systems were still compromised. Try the emergency frequency, Bill suggested. Military bands. Reynolds switched to the international emergency frequency. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Any station, any station. This is Delta 473. More static, then a faint voice broke through. Delta 473, this is RAF Northwood. Reading you broken and distorted. Can you confirm your situation? RAF Northwood, Delta 473, Reynolds replied. We have multiple system failures. Right engine failing. Hydraulics compromised. Navigation unreliable. Possible security threat on board. Request vectors to nearest suitable airport. Copy that, Delta 473, the RAF controller responded. Stand by for coordinates. As Reynolds worked with the controller, James focused entirely on flying the crippled aircraft. The right engine was now down to 15% power. The asymmetric thrust made the aircraft want to yaw constantly to the right. He compensated with rudder input, but it required constant attention. Bill had opened up the maintenance panel and was physically disconnecting certain systems. Isolating the flight management computers from non-essential functions, he explained. Old Cold War trick. When in doubt, cut the wires. James managed a tight smile. Just like those training exercises over the Barents Sea. Exactly, Bill agreed, when the Soviets tried jamming our communications. Go manual, go basic. Reynolds finished his communication with RAF Northwood. They're coordinating with Keflavik. We're cleared for emergency landing. They're scrambling response teams now. ETA, James asked. Approximately 1 hour 40 minutes, Reynolds calculated. If we can maintain current speed and altitude. A heavy silence fell over the cockpit. All three men knew the unspoken reality. With a failing engine, compromised hydraulics, and unknown factors still potentially affecting aircraft systems, maintaining speed and altitude for that long would be challenging at best, impossible at worst. We need a closer option, James said finally. Something within 1 hour's flight time. Reynolds studied the charts. There's a NATO air base in the Faroe Islands. Shorter runway, but they handle P-3 Orions and occasionally C-130s. Should be adequate for emergency landing. How long? Bill asked. Approximately 50 minutes, Reynolds estimated. If we can navigate there accurately. James nodded. We'll navigate the old-fashioned way if we have to. Bill smiled grimly. Star charts and dead reckoning. Just like the good old days before GPS. The plane shuddered again, more violently this time. Warning alarms blared. The right engine's sound changed dramatically. Right engine flame out, James announced, his voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. Complete loss of thrust. The Boeing 777 lurched. James compensated, immediately adjusting rudder and ailerons to maintain level flight. The control column fought against his inputs, but his years of experience with unresponsive aircraft gave him the edge. Declaring emergency to all frequencies, Reynolds broadcast, Delta 473, right engine failure, diverting to NATO Faroe Islands facility. The cockpit door opened again. Emily Davis returned, her face pale but composed. The device is contained, she reported, but there's more. The air marshals found 2 more similar devices on the suspect. And, she hesitated. And what Ms. Davis, Reynolds prompted. The suspect mentioned others, she said quietly. He wasn't working alone. The 3 men exchanged grave looks. One saboteur was bad enough. The possibility of multiple conspirators on board changed the situation dramatically. Did he say how many others? Bill asked. No, Emily replied. He just laughed and said it was too late to stop what was coming. Classic terrorist tactic, James noted. Create fear and uncertainty. Bill nodded. Could be bluffing, could be telling the truth. We have to assume the worst. Air marshals are conducting a sweep of the aircraft, Emily added. But with 240 passengers, it's slow going. James made another adjustment to maintain level flight. The aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control with just one engine. Every minute that passed required more strength, more concentration, more precise inputs. We need to accelerate that search, Reynolds decided. Focus on anyone traveling alone, anyone showing suspicious behavior. He turned to Emily. Miss Davis, your technical expertise would be valuable. Can you help identify other potential electronic threats? Emily nodded without hesitation. Of course. As she turned to leave, her eyes met James's again. This time her gaze lingered. Something flickered across her face. A question forming, a memory trying to surface. Colonel Sullivan, she said slowly. You served during the Gulf War. James felt his chest tighten. Here it was, the moment he'd been dreading and expecting in equal measure. Yes, he replied simply. Operation Blackwing. She continued, her voice barely audible above the aircraft's strained engines. It wasn't a question. The cockpit fell silent except for the alarms and the laboring sound of the remaining engine. We'll discuss this later, Ms. Davis, Reynolds intervened gently. Right now, we need your help with the security sweep. Emily hesitated, then nodded curtly. Of course, Captain. She left without another word, but the tension remained in her wake. She knows, Bill said quietly. She was bound to find out eventually, James replied, his voice tight. I just hoped it wouldn't be 30,000 feet above the Atlantic in a crippled aircraft. Reynolds looked between them. Will this be a problem, Colonel? James shook his head. No, sir. The mission comes first. Always has. The irony of his words wasn't lost on any of them. It was precisely that philosophy that had led to Lieutenant Robert Davis's death 25 years ago. The mission comes first. The hard call that had orphaned the young woman who now moved through the cabin, helping search for additional threats. Hydraulic pressure dropping again. Bill reported, bringing their focus back to the immediate crisis. Standby system is struggling. James felt the control response becoming even more sluggish. Control surfaces losing effectiveness. Need more rudder input to maintain heading. Reynolds studied their situation grimly. At this rate, we may not make it to the Faroe Islands base. Options, James asked, never taking his eyes off the instruments. Ditch in the Atlantic, Reynolds said. Not ideal in these conditions. Survival rate, Bill asked. In these seas, Reynolds shook his head. Maybe 50%, if we're lucky. James considered their situation. A crippled aircraft, deteriorating control, potential saboteurs still on board, and somehow in the middle of it all, Robert Davis's daughter, who now knew exactly who he was. The mission comes first. But what exactly was the mission now? Get the aircraft on the ground safely, protect the NATO missile defense expert and his documents. Make sure Emily Davis survived when her father hadn't. Perhaps all of them. We press on for the Faroe Islands, James decided. We've flown worse aircraft in worse conditions. Bill nodded in agreement. During the Cold War, I once flew an SR-71 with a cracked windshield and partial engine failure through an Arctic storm. This is practically a milk run by comparison. Reynolds managed a tight smile. With all due respect, gentlemen, this isn't a fighter jet or a spy plane. It's a commercial airliner with 240 souls on board. Principles are the same, James replied. Fly the aircraft first. Deal with everything else second. He made another adjustment to counter the aircraft's increasing tendency to yaw right. We'll get her on the ground. The determination in his voice seemed to reassure Reynolds. All right, Colonel, we proceed to Faroe Islands NATO facility. James nodded, his focus entirely on the struggling aircraft. In his mind, Robert Davis's face merged with his daughter's. 2 generations separated by tragedy, connected by duty. The mission comes first. But sometimes, if you were skilled enough, determined enough, you could complete the mission and still bring everyone home. 25 years ago, James Sullivan had made a call that haunted him every day since. Today, he had a chance to make a different call, to prove that the sacrifice hadn't been in vain, to show Emily Davis that her father's death had meant something. The Boeing 777 shuddered beneath his hands, fighting him with every passing minute. But James held firm. He'd flown damaged F-16s through anti-aircraft fire, had landed with one wing shredded by missile fragments, had brought aircraft home when physics and probability said it couldn't be done. He would bring this one home too. He owed it to the passengers, to Captain Reynolds, to Bill, his old mentor, to himself, and most of all to Emily Davis and the father she had never known. 45 minutes to Faroe Islands, Reynolds announced. If we can maintain current speed and altitude, we'll maintain it, James replied, his voice a promise and a prayer. Outside the cockpit windows, the first faint light of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon, a new day breaking over the Atlantic. Whether they would live to see it fully dawn remained to be seen. The rising sun painted the storm clouds in violent shades of amber and crimson. Inside the cockpit of Delta Flight 473, the red warning lights created an apocalyptic glow across the instrument panels. James Sullivan's arms strained against the controls as the aircraft bucked and yawed through turbulence. With only the left engine functioning, the Boeing 777 constantly pulled right, requiring continuous correction. 38 minutes to Faroe Islands approach. Captain Reynolds announced, his voice tight with controlled tension. Bill Harrison monitored the failing systems from the engineer station. Hydraulic pressure continuing to drop. Flight control responsiveness down to 60%. James nodded, never taking his eyes off the instruments. His years as a fighter pilot had taught him to absorb critical information while maintaining absolute focus. She's getting heavier in the controls, like flying through molasses. Reynolds watched the former Air Force colonel with quiet admiration. Sullivan's forearms bulged with the effort of controlling the wounded aircraft, but his face remained calm, his breathing measured. This was a man who had flown combat missions through anti-aircraft fire, who had made split-second decisions that determined whether men lived or died. The interphone buzzed. Reynolds answered. Captain Air Marshal Davis reporting, came Emily's voice, professional, despite the underlying tension. We've completed our sweep of the main cabin. No additional devices found, but we've isolated 3 passengers who were traveling separately but appear to know each other. They're under observation. Any evidence they're involved? Reynolds asked. Nothing concrete, Emily replied, but their documentation shows inconsistencies. One claims to be Canadian, but wasn't familiar with basic information about Toronto, where he supposedly lives. Reynolds glanced at James and Bill. Both men recognized the significance. False identities, coordinated operation, professional tradecraft. Keep them separated and under watch, Reynolds instructed. Any update on the original suspect? Still refusing to talk, Emily reported. But we found something interesting. He has a military tattoo partially concealed under his sleeve. Appears to be Eastern European in origin. Bill's eyes narrowed. Ask her if it's a bear claw gripping a lightning bolt. Reynolds relayed the question. After a moment, Emily's surprised voice returned. Yes, exactly that. How did Colonel Harrison know? Bill's face had hardened into a mask of cold recognition. Vostok Group, Special Operations Unit formed in the final years of the Soviet Union, evolved into a mercenary outfit after the collapse. Highly trained, specialized in sabotage and electronic warfare. You've encountered them before, James asked, making another adjustment to counter a sudden roll tendency. Barents Sea, 1988, Bill confirmed grimly. They tried to bring down our SR-71 during a recon mission. Nearly succeeded. Used very similar electronic countermeasures. The implications settled heavily in the cockpit. This wasn't random terrorism. It was a sophisticated operation carried out by trained operatives. The NATO conference, Reynolds concluded, that has to be the target. More specifically, the missile defense system plans, James added. That kind of technology would be invaluable to certain governments. Bill nodded. And bringing down a plane full of NATO officials and defense contractors would be a bonus. Psychological warfare and practical intelligence gathering in one operation. The aircraft shuddered violently, dropping several hundred feet before James could arrest the descent. Warning alarms blared as system after system registered complaints. Hydraulic pressure critical, Bill reported. Electrical system showing power fluctuations. Reynolds keyed the interphone again. Ms. Davis, we believe we're dealing with operatives from a group called Vostok, former Soviet Special Forces. They likely have advanced electronic warfare capabilities. Can you work with the air marshals to collect all passenger electronic devices? Anything that could be remotely triggered or used to transmit signals. Yes, Captain, Emily replied without hesitation. I'll coordinate immediately. As Reynolds ended the communication, James asked the question that hung in the air. Does she know who these people are, what they're capable of? She's Robert Davis's daughter, Bill said quietly. Smart as a whip according to her file. Military clearance despite being a civilian contractor. She knows. The mention of Robert Davis sent a fresh wave of memories crashing through James's mind. The young lieutenant had been brilliant, top of his class, the kind of officer who would have made general someday. And James had made the call that ended his life. Now his daughter was walking through a cabin potentially containing more Vostok operatives, putting herself at risk to save the same aircraft that James was struggling to keep in the air. The parallels weren't lost on him. 32 minutes to approach, Reynolds updated, studying the navigation display. NATO Faro base is coordinating with us. They've cleared all other traffic and have emergency response teams standing by. James nodded, feeling the aircraft becoming increasingly unresponsive. The control column now required his full strength to move even slightly. The Boeing 777 was designed with multiple redundant systems, but those redundancies were failing one by one. We need to prepare for worst-case scenarios, he said. If we lose hydraulics completely, we'll have minimal control surface authority. Bill understood immediately. Like United 232 in Sioux City, using differential thrust to steer. Exactly, James confirmed. I'll need you both to help manage power settings if it comes to that. Reynolds nodded grimly. I've trained for it in the simulator. Never thought I'd need to use it. Let's hope we don't, James replied. The interphone buzzed again. This time it was the lead flight attendant. Captain, we have a situation in the main cabin, she reported, her voice tight with strain. 2 of the suspicious passengers are becoming agitated. The air marshals are containing the situation, but it's escalating. Reynolds exchanged concerned glances with James and Bill. What about Ms. Davis? She's helping collect electronic devices, but she's aware of the situation. Tell the air marshals to use whatever force necessary to maintain control, Reynolds instructed. We can't afford a security breach with 30 minutes to landing. As Reynolds ended the call, Bill moved to the cockpit door and engaged the additional security locks. Just in case they get past the air marshals, he explained, we can't risk losing the cockpit. James felt the weight of responsibility press down on him. 240 souls, multiple saboteurs, critical NATO secrets, and a crippled aircraft that was becoming harder to control with each passing minute. We need to consider what happens if we lose hydraulics completely before reaching the Faroes, he said, his voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. Reynolds nodded. Ditch in the ocean. Last resort, James replied, but we should prepare the cabin just in case. Reynolds keyed the cabin announcement system. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are continuing to deal with technical difficulties and are diverting to a NATO facility in the Faroe Islands. As a precaution, I'm asking the cabin crew to review emergency water landing procedures. This is strictly precautionary, but I need everyone to pay close attention to their instructions. As Reynolds completed his announcement, the aircraft lurched violently to the right. James threw his weight against the control column, fighting to level the wings. Warning alarms screamed as the autopilot disconnected completely. Hydraulic pressure 0 on main and standby systems. Bill reported, his voice tense but controlled. Flight control, computer, showing multiple failures. James felt the controls go slack in his hands. The primary control surfaces were now frozen immovable without hydraulic pressure. The aircraft began a slow, inexorable roll to the right. Implementing differential thrust protocol, James announced, shifting his hands to the engine controls. By adjusting the power on the remaining left engine, he could create enough asymmetric thrust to partially control the aircraft's direction. It was like trying to steer a car using only the gas pedal. Crude and precise, but their only option. Reynolds, take over communications and navigation, James instructed. Bill, monitor systems and call out altitude and bank angles. I need to focus entirely on aircraft control. Both men moved to their assignments without question. The cockpit fell into a rhythm of terse updates and acknowledgments as James fought to stabilize the wounded airliner. Right bank 20 degrees, Bill called. Altitude 29,000, descending 300 feet per minute. James eased back on the left engine power, allowing the nose to drop slightly. The reduced power lessened the turning tendency, bringing the wings closer to level. Bank 15 degrees, altitude 28,700. James had never flown a commercial airliner without hydraulics, but the physics were the same as any aircraft. Thrust, drag, lift, gravity, the dance of forces that had been his professional language for decades. Bank 8 degrees, nearly level, Bill reported. Descent rate stabilizing at 200 feet per minute. James allowed himself a small breath of relief. He had the aircraft under tenuous control. Not enough for a conventional landing, but enough to keep them in the air a while longer. Reynolds finished coordinating with NATO Faro Base. They understand our situation. Fire crews and medical teams are standing by. They're clearing a straight-in approach to runway 30, which gives us the longest available landing surface. James nodded, never taking his attention from the delicate balance of thrust and attitude that was keeping them airborne. Time to landing. 27 minutes at current speed and descent rate, Reynolds calculated. We'll be too high on approach. Need to increase descent rate to approximately 500 feet per minute. I'll adjust once we're closer, James replied. For now, maintaining control is the priority. The interphone buzzed again. Reynolds answered, his expression growing darker as he listened. Situation update, he reported after disconnecting. Air marshals have restrained one more Vostok operative, but they believe at least one is still unaccounted for, and they've found evidence of explosives. Explosives, Bill echoed, his face paling. Reynolds nodded grimly. Small charges, according to Ms. Davis's assessment, not enough to destroy the aircraft, but potentially placed to damage critical systems. That explains the cascading failures, James said, making a minute adjustment to the thrust. They're not trying to bring us down immediately. They want to force us to land at sea away from secure facilities, where they could potentially retrieve the NATO documents in the confusion, Bill concluded. Clever. Too clever, James muttered. Ms. Davis and the air marshals need to find that last operative, and the charges. Reynolds relayed the instructions, then turned back to the navigation systems. NATO Faro is trying to get fighters airborne to escort us in, but the storm system is making takeoffs difficult. James concentrated on maintaining their tenuous stability. The Boeing 777 wallowed through the air like a wounded whale, responding sluggishly to his thrust adjustments. Without hydraulics, the normal control surfaces were useless. They were flying a 775,000-pound glider with a single engine, providing both thrust and directional control. Colonel Bill said quietly, "We need to discuss the landing." James nodded, knowing what was coming. No hydraulics means no flaps, no slats, no spoilers, no nose wheel steering, and most critically, no brakes. Conventional landing is impossible, Bill confirmed. Even United 232 had some brake capacity. Reynolds looked between them. Options, James had considered their dire situation. Runway arrestor system. Reynolds shook his head. NATO Faro doesn't have the full system. They have some barriers at the end of the runway, but nothing designed to stop an aircraft this size. What about a controlled crash landing, Bill suggested. Gear down, but accept that we'll lose the undercarriage on touchdown. Use the belly of the aircraft for braking action. James weighed the proposal. It would subject the passengers to extreme forces. The structural integrity of the aircraft would be compromised. But with proper preparation, it offered their best chance of survival. It's our best option, he agreed finally, but we need to prepare the cabin extensively. Full brace position, all loose items secured, and we need to aim for the very beginning of the runway to use its entire length. Reynolds nodded and reached for the interphone to brief the cabin crew when another violent shudder ran through the aircraft. The deck tilted sharply as the nose dropped. Warning alarm screamed. "Left engine fire," Bill shouted. "Power dropping rapidly." James reacted instantly, adjusting the throttle to maintain what control he could. But with the left engine failing, they lost not only thrust, but their primary means of directional control. Altitude 26,000, descending at 1,000 feet per minute, Bill reported. Bank angle increasing to 30 degrees right. James fought to stabilize the aircraft, but physics was working against them. Without engine thrust to counter the natural right-turning tendency, the Boeing 777 began an inexorable spiral descent. Fire suppression activated, Reynolds reported, but engine parameters show catastrophic damage. The implications were clear to all three men. Without hydraulics, and now without engine thrust, the aircraft was no longer controllable in any meaningful sense. It would continue its spiral descent until it impacted the ocean. Time to impact at current descent rate, James asked, his voice eerily calm. Bill made the grim calculation. Approximately 18 minutes. Reynolds reached for the cabin announcement system, then hesitated, looking to James. What could they possibly tell the passengers before he could decide? The interphone buzzed. Reynolds answered. Captain, this is Ms. Davis. Emily's voice came through, breathless but determined. We've found the last operative. He was attempting to access the electronics bay beneath the cabin floor. The air marshals have him restrained, and we've located what appears to be the control device for the explosives. A flicker of hope. But without engine power or hydraulics, they were still in a death spiral. Can you disarm it? Reynolds asked. I believe so, Emily replied. And Captain, there's something else. The suspect had schematics of the Boeing 707 electrical system, specifically the auxiliary power unit in the Ram air turbine deployment system. James and Bill exchanged sharp glances. The Ram air turbine rat was an emergency device that deployed from the aircraft belly using airflow to generate hydraulic pressure and electricity when main systems failed. It wasn't powerful enough to provide full control, but it might give them enough to break the spiral. Ms. Davis, we need that Ram air turbine deployed immediately, James instructed. The manual override is in the electronics bay right where you are. I see it, Emily confirmed. It's a red handle behind a plastic cover. Pull it, James ordered. Now. Through the interphone came the sound of breaking plastic, then a mechanical thunk as Emily pulled the handle. Seconds later, a shudder ran through the aircraft as the small turbine deployed into the airstream beneath the fuselage. The instrument panels flickered, then some of the hydraulic pressure gauges began to show minimal readings. We have partial hydraulic pressure, Bill announced, 3% in building. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. James immediately tested the ailerons, feeling the slightest response through the control column. With painstaking precision, he made tiny inputs using the minimal control authority to counter their spiral. Bank angle decreasing, Bill reported. 25 degrees, 20 degrees. Sweat beaded on James's forehead as he focused entirely on the minute control inputs. Too much and he'd over-control, potentially making their situation worse. Too little and the spiral would continue. 15 degrees, 10 degrees, almost level. The spiral arrested James now faced a new challenge. The aircraft was descending at 800 feet per minute with minimal control authority and no engine power. They were essentially piloting a massive glider with severely limited control surfaces. Can we restart the left engine? He asked. Reynolds shook his head after checking the fire indication system. Negative, fire is contained, but the damage is too severe. Distance to Faroe Islands, James asked. Approximately 115 nautical miles, Reynolds reported after consulting the navigation display. At our current speed and descent rate, he paused, making the mental calculation. We won't make it. The stark reality settled over the cockpit. Even with the partial hydraulic pressure from the Ram air turbine without engine power, they would impact the ocean approximately 50 miles short of the Faroe Islands. Options, James prompted, never ceasing his delicate control inputs. Ditch in the ocean, Reynolds suggested. We have enough control now to attempt a controlled water landing. Bill shook his head. Water temperature is near freezing. Survival time would be minutes, not hours. And in these sea conditions, rescue would be extremely difficult. James considered their situation with the calculating precision that had defined his military career. A damaged aircraft, no engine power, minimal control, 240 souls depending on his decisions. And Emily Davis, whose father had already paid the ultimate price under his command. Not this time, he thought with sudden, fierce determination. Not on my watch, not again. We need to get the APU online, he said. The auxiliary power unit was a small turbine in the aircraft's tail that provided electrical power and limited pneumatic pressure when the main engines weren't running. APU is showing fault codes, Reynolds replied, checking the relevant panel. Sabotage, most likely. Ms. Davis, James called through the interphone. The schematics the suspect had, did they show the APU electrical connections? Yes, Emily confirmed. He appears to have crossed several control wires, creating a false fault indication. Can you restore the original connections? A pause. I believe so, with guidance. James looked to Reynolds, who nodded and took over. I'll talk her through it. You focus on maintaining control. As Reynolds began providing detailed instructions to Emily, James concentrated on keeping the aircraft stable. The partial hydraulic pressure from the rat gave him just enough control authority to maintain level flight, but their descent continued inexorably. Every minute brought them 800 feet closer to the ocean's surface. Bill moved beside James, speaking quietly. Even if we get the APU running, it won't provide thrust, just electrical power and some systems support. I know, James replied, his eyes never leaving the instruments. But it might buy us time to find a solution, or at least get closer to land. The minutes ticked by. Their altitude continued to decrease, 24,000 feet, 23,000. The partial hydraulic pressure made the aircraft controllable, but couldn't stop the inevitable descent of a massive airliner without engine power. Miss Davis has restored the APU wiring, Reynolds reported finally. Attempting start sequence. They waited, tension mounting. The APU start sequence normally took about 30 seconds. APU start failed, Reynolds announced grimly. Battery power insufficient. Another setback. The saboteurs had been thorough, ensuring that even backup systems would be compromised. James thought rapidly, drawing on decades of aviation experience. The RAD is generating electrical power. Can we divert all of it to the APU start sequence, temporarily shut down non-essential systems? Reynolds considered this. Risky. We'd lose some instruments and communications temporarily, but it might provide enough power for the APU start. Do it, James decided. Reynolds began the complex process of rerouting electrical power, shutting down non-essential systems one by one. Cabin lighting dimmed. Some instrument panels went dark. The temperature began to drop as the environmental control system powered down. All available power diverted to APU start circuit, Reynolds announced, initiating start sequence now. Again they waited. 21,000 feet, 85 nautical miles from the Faroe Islands. A low whine built from the rear of the aircraft, the sound of a turbine spooling up. APU start successful, Reynolds reported, unable to keep the excitement from his voice. Electrical power restored. The instrument panels flickered back to life. Cabin lights brightened, but they were still descending at 800 feet per minute with no main engine power. What about the pneumatic system from the APU? James asked. Can we use it to pressurize the hydraulic reservoirs? Reynolds shook his head. Not enough pressure. The APU pneumatic system is designed for starting engines and environmental control, not hydraulic pressurization. They were running out of options. And altitude. The interphone buzzed again. Reynolds answered. Captain, this is Ms. Davis. We've disarmed the explosive devices, and we found something else. The saboteurs had a satellite communication device. They've been transmitting our position and status. To whom? Reynolds asked. Unknown. But the device was set to a frequency range typically used by military operations. James and Bill exchanged knowing glances. This wasn't just about bringing down a civilian aircraft or stealing NATO documents. It was about creating an international incident. What's our position? James asked momentarily, taking his eyes off the instruments to look at the navigation display. North Atlantic, approximately 75 nautical miles southeast of the Faroe Islands, Reynolds reported. Over international waters, but within the United Kingdom search and rescue region. And our rate of descent, 800 feet per minute, altitude 19,500. James made a rapid calculation. At current descent rate, will impact in approximately 24 minutes, about 45 nautical miles short of the Faroes. The stark reality hung in the cockpit. They had stabilized the aircraft, restored some systems, and neutralized the immediate threat from the saboteurs. But they were still going to crash into the frigid North Atlantic with minimal survival chances. Unless... The NATO base on the Faroes, James said suddenly. What assets do they have? Reynolds checked the information provided by air traffic control. Standard search and rescue. Helicopters, fast response boats. But in these weather conditions, their effectiveness would be limited. What about aircraft? James pressed. Military aircraft, Reynolds reviewed the information again. They have a detachment of F-35s for air defense and 2 C-130 Hercules transport aircraft. James's eyes lit with a dangerous intensity that Bill recognized immediately. No, Bill said flatly. Whatever you're thinking, it's too risky. Riskier than ditching in freezing water in these sea conditions, James countered. What's the survival probability there? Reynolds reluctantly provided the grim assessment. Given water temperature, sea state, and distance from shore, maybe 20%, and that's optimistic. So we need a better option, James said with quiet determination. Bill studied his former student's face. You have that look, Maverick, the same one you had before Operation Blackwing. James didn't flinch at the reference. We need a miracle, Bill. And sometimes miracles require crazy ideas. Reynolds looked between them. What exactly are you proposing, Colonel? James took a deep breath. The C-130 Hercules has been used for mid-air retrieval operations. Special forces use it to extract personnel from areas where landing isn't possible. The aircraft flies overhead and snags a line pulling up the personnel. Reynolds stared at him. You're not suggesting... I'm suggesting we use the same principle, James continued, not for personnel, but for aircraft stabilization. It's never been done, Bill objected. Not with an aircraft this size. It doesn't need to carry us, James explained. Just provide enough aerodynamic stability and lift to get us within gliding distance of the runway. The concept was audacious to the point of insanity, using a C-130 to essentially tow a crippled Boeing 777 just enough to extend its glide path to reach the runway. The stress on the airframe would be enormous, Reynolds warned. Both aircraft would be at risk. Both aircraft are already at risk, James countered. This gives us a chance. Reynolds considered the radical proposal. Even if NATO agreed, how would we physically connect the aircraft? We don't have the specialized equipment. We improvise, James replied. The overwing exits have reinforced frames designed to support evacuation slides. If we could run cables from those points to a C-130 flying above us, the physics might work, Bill admitted reluctantly. The C-130 wouldn't be carrying our weight, just providing enough aerodynamic influence to extend our glide ratio. Reynolds shook his head in disbelief. This is beyond unorthodox, Colonel. It's never been attempted. Neither was landing a DC-10 with no hydraulics until United 232 did it, James replied. Sometimes you have to write the manual as you go. A tense silence filled the cockpit as Reynolds weighed the proposal. Their altitude continued to decrease. 18,000 feet, 17,500. What's the alternative? James pressed gently. We ditch in the ocean and hope for the best, or we try something unconventional that might save everyone on board. Reynolds made his decision. I'll contact NATO Faro Base with the request, but the final authorization will have to come from their commanding officer. As Reynolds began the communication, Bill moved closer to James. This is insane, you know that, right? Calculated risk, James corrected, just like the old days. The old days nearly got us killed more times than I can count, Bill reminded him. James allowed himself a grim smile. But we're still here. Colonel Sullivan, Emily's voice came through the interphone. She had been silent during their strategic discussion. The air marshals have the situation fully contained. All saboteurs are restrained. No additional threats detected. Good work, Ms. Davis, James replied. A pause then. Request permission to enter the cockpit. Pitt, I believe I can assist with your unconventional plan. James glanced at Reynolds, who had just finished his initial communication with NATO Faro Base. Reynolds nodded. Permission granted, James confirmed. Moments later, the cockpit door opened. Emily Davis stepped inside, her expression a complex mixture of determination and something else, something James couldn't quite identify. You heard our discussion, he asked. She nodded. Your plan to use a C-130 as an aerodynamic stabilizer. It's unprecedented, but theoretically sound. Theoretically being the operative word, Bill muttered. I've worked on similar concepts, Emily continued. Not for aircraft this size, but the principles are the same, and I have practical experience with high-tension cable systems. James studied her face. Robert Davis's eyes looked back at him, filled with the same intelligence and determination he remembered in the young lieutenant. NATO is considering our request, Reynolds reported, returning to the conversation. They're consulting with their engineering team and the C-130 pilots. Emily moved to the systems panel, analyzing the current aircraft status. The structural integrity of the overwing exit frames should be sufficient if we distribute the load properly. We'd need at least 4 connection points. And the C-130 would need to match our airspeed precisely, James added, while maintaining position directly above us. In severe turbulence, Bill pointed out, with limited visibility. The APU is providing electrical power, Emily noted. We could use the landing lights pointing upward to improve visibility for the C-130 pilot. The technical discussion continued, the three men and Emily rapidly developing the unprecedented procedure. Their collective experience spanning military aviation, commercial operations, and aerospace engineering created a synergy that transformed an impossible idea into a potentially viable plan. Reynolds received an update from NATO Faro Base. They're willing to attempt it. They have a C-130J Super Hercules with an experienced crew preparing for immediate takeoff. ETA to our position, approximately 15 minutes. James checked their altitude and position. We'll be down to 14,000 feet by then, approximately 60 nautical miles from the runway. Still too far to glide in, Bill calculated, even with perfect conditions. Then we need to improve our aerodynamic efficiency, James decided, reduce our descent rate as much as possible. Emily was already analyzing the problem. If we could reduce our descent rate from 800 to 500 feet per minute, we'd gain significant gliding distance. Without engine power or full control surfaces, how do we improve efficiency? Reynolds asked. Angle of attack, James replied, and weight distribution. We need to move passengers and cargo to optimize the center of gravity. Emily nodded in agreement. The 707's optimal glide ratio is approximately 17:1. We're currently achieving maybe 12:1 due to the damage in configuration. If we could improve that even slightly, every nautical mile counts, James finished. Reynolds relayed instructions to the cabin crew to redistribute passengers toward the center of the aircraft. Meanwhile, James made minute adjustments to their attitude, finding the optimal angle for maximum glide efficiency. Descent rate decreasing, Bill reported. 700 feet per minute, 650, 600. James felt a surge of cautious optimism. They were buying themselves precious minutes and miles. NATO Faro Base reports C-130 is airborne, Reynolds announced. ETA 12 minutes. Now for the hard part, James said. How do we physically connect the aircraft? Emily had been considering this challenge. The emergency equipment includes fire axes and multiple rolls of high-tension cable for securing loose cargo. We could create anchor points at the overwing exits using seat frame components. We'd need volunteers to help with the connection, Reynolds noted. It would be extremely dangerous. I'll coordinate it, Emily offered without hesitation. James looked at her sharply. Ms. Davis, this operation will require someone to be partially outside the aircraft at 15,000 feet in severe turbulence, with temperatures well below freezing. I'm aware of the risks, Colonel, she replied, meeting his gaze directly, and I'm the most qualified person on board. The unspoken tension between them intensified. She was volunteering for a mission that could easily kill her, just as her father had volunteered for Operation Blackwing 25 years ago. We need more than one person, Bill interjected. The connection points need to be established simultaneously on both sides of the aircraft. The air marshals have volunteered, Emily said. They're already preparing the equipment. James wanted to object, to protect her from the danger, but he recognized the determination in her eyes. The same determination that had made her father one of the finest pilots in the squadron. Very well, he conceded, but you'll follow exact protocols. No unnecessary risks. Of course, Colonel, she replied formally. As she turned to leave, James called after her. Ms. Davis? She paused, looking back. Your father would be proud. Something flickered across her face. Pain recognition, perhaps even a hint of forgiveness. I know, she said simply, then left to prepare for the dangerous operation. Reynolds looked at James with new understanding. You two have unfinished business. History, James corrected quietly, and maybe a chance to rewrite it. The altimeter continued its inexorable countdown. 15,000 feet, 14,500. The coast of the Faroe Islands was visible on the horizon, a dark smudge against the stormy sky. Still too far to reach with their current glide ratio. NATO Faro Base reports C-130 7 minutes out, Reynolds announced. They've completed an emergency briefing on the procedure. James nodded, focusing entirely on maintaining the optimal glide attitude. Every foot of altitude was precious now, every minute of flight time critical. Bill monitored their systems and trajectory. At current descent rate, we'll be at approximately 12,000 feet when the C-130 reaches us, 50 nautical miles from the runway. Still need to improve our glide by at least 10 miles, James calculated. The minutes passed with agonizing slowness. The cockpit fell silent except for terse updates on their position altitude and the approaching C-130. Each man was absorbed in his own thoughts, calculating odds, considering variables, perhaps even making peace with whatever outcome awaited them. Visual contact with C-130, Reynolds reported suddenly. 2 o'clock high range 5 miles. James glimpsed the four-engine turboprop through breaks in the cloud. The military transport aircraft was approaching cautiously, its distinctive profile, a welcome sight against the threatening sky. NATO Faro Base has patched us through to the C-130 pilot, Reynolds announced, adjusting the radio. Delta 473, this is Reach 328, came a confident voice with a slight southern accent. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Miller commanding. Heard you folks could use a hand. James's heart skipped a beat. Frank Miller. The name registered immediately. A young captain during Operation Desert Storm. One of the men James and his squadron had saved by destroying the anti-aircraft installation during Operation Blackwing. The mission that had cost Lieutenant Davis his life. Reach 328 Delta 473, James responded. Colonel James Sullivan at the controls. Good to hear your voice, Frank. A momentary pause then. Maverick, is that really you? Surprise and recognition filled Miller's voice. Affirmative, James confirmed. Seems like I'm still getting you out of trouble after all these years. A short laugh. Looks like we're returning the favor today. My crew is prepared to attempt your crazy idea. Just like old times, huh? Just like old times, James agreed. The cosmic coincidence wasn't lost on him. 25 years ago, he had made a call that saved Miller and dozens of other men at the cost of Robert Davis's life. Now Miller was here attempting an equally risky maneuver to save James along with Emily Davis and 238 other souls. The universe had a strange sense of symmetry. Connection teams are in position, Reynolds reported. Overwing exits open and an anchor points established. James could only imagine the scene in the cabin. Passengers secured in brace positions. The bitter cold of high-altitude air rushing in through the open exits. Emily and the air marshals fighting wind and cold to secure connection points for a procedure that had never been attempted. Reach 328, we're ready to begin approach, James radioed. We'll illuminate upper fuselage with landing lights for visual reference. Copy that, Delta 473, Miller responded. Beginning approach now. We'll maintain 50 feet vertical separation until connections are established. The massive C-130 maneuvered carefully above them, fighting the same turbulence that buffeted the Boeing 777. Military pilots were trained for precision flying, but this operation pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Reach 328 in position, Reynolds reported. 50 feet above, slightly offset to port. Now came the most dangerous part. The C-130 would lower 4 connection cables with weighted ends. Emily and the air marshals would need to capture these cables and secure them to the anchor points they had created. Cables deploying, Miller radioed, targeting overwing exit positions. James maintained rock-steady control of the aircraft, keeping it as stable as possible despite the turbulence. Any sudden movement could send the dangling cables in unpredictable directions and potentially striking the fuselage or empennage. First cable captured port forward, came Emily's voice through the interphone, securing to anchor point. One by one, the connection teams reported successful captures. Port forward, port aft, starboard aft. 4 cables creating a rectangular connection pattern between the 2 aircraft. All cables secured and tensioned, Emily reported finally. Connection complete. Reach 328 connections established, James radioed, beginning coordinated descent. Copy that, Delta 473, Miller acknowledged. We'll match your speed and provide gentle upward tension. Be advised we're at maximum sustainable power. The physics were daunting. The C-130 wasn't actually lifting the Boeing 777. It was providing just enough upward force to improve their glide ratio while maintaining a stable aerodynamic platform. Descent rate decreasing, Bill reported with cautious optimism. 500 feet per minute, 450. It was working. The unprecedented mid-air connection was actually improving their glide performance. The coastline of the Faroe Islands grew more distinct. The runway, still invisible from their altitude, was perhaps within reach now. Updated glide calculations, Reynolds announced. At current descent rate, we should reach the runway threshold with approximately 800 feet of altitude remaining. A thin margin, but a margin nonetheless. For the first time since the crisis began, there was a real possibility they might all survive. Emily returned to the cockpit, her face reddened from the extreme cold, but her eyes bright with adrenaline and determination. Connection is holding. The C-130 pilot is maintaining perfect position. James nodded, never taking his eyes off the instruments. Well done, Ms. Davis. She moved beside him, studying his technique as he made minute adjustments to maintain optimal attitude. You're using the elevators to fine-tune our angle of attack, she observed. The ram air turbine is providing just enough hydraulic pressure. Every half-degree matters, James confirmed. It's the difference between reaching the runway or falling short. Emily watched him work, her expression thoughtful. You flew with my father. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't accusatory, simply a statement of fact. Yes, James replied. He was one of the finest pilots I ever commanded. She nodded slowly. My mother told me about Operation Blackwing, about the choice you had to make. James's hands tightened imperceptibly on the controls. It's a choice no commander ever wants to face. But you made it, Emily said quietly. You completed the mission, saved hundreds of lives. At the cost of your father's, James acknowledged the pain still fresh after 25 years. Emily was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. My mother never blamed you. She understood the realities of war, the impossible decisions. James glanced at her, surprised. She told you that? She made sure I knew the whole story, Emily confirmed, that my father died saving others, that his sacrifice meant something. The revelation struck James deeply. For 25 years, he had carried the weight of Robert Davis's death, had imagined his widow and daughter cursing his name, had seen an accusation in Emily's eyes when she first recognized him. But there was no accusation now, only understanding, and perhaps something else, something like forgiveness. Thank you, he said simply, for telling me that. Before Emily could respond, Bill called out, Faroe Islands coastline in visual range, runway visible, distance 22 nautical miles. The critical moment approached. They were still connected to the C-130, still descending at a reduced rate thanks to the unprecedented aerial configuration, but soon they would need to disconnect and make their final approach. NATO Faroe base reports runway cleared and foamed, Reynolds announced. Emergency equipment in position. Current altitude 9,000 feet, Bill reported. Descent rate 400 feet per minute. James made his decision. We'll maintain the connection until 10 nautical miles from the runway. That should give us enough altitude for the final approach. What about the landing itself? Reynolds asked. We still have no brakes, no spoilers, minimal steering. One challenge at a time, James replied with grim humor. First, let's get to the runway. Emily returned to her position near the systems panel, monitoring the connection status. Cable tension stable. C-130 maintaining position perfectly. The coastline of the Faroe Islands grew larger in the windscreen. Rugged cliffs and green highlands emerged from the stormy sea. The NATO airbase came into view, its runway drawing a thin gray line against the landscape. Distance 15 nautical miles, Bill announced. Altitude 7,000 feet. James felt a growing sense of cautious optimism. They might actually pull this off. The unprecedented aerial connection had extended their glide range just enough to reach the runway. Reach 328 Delta 473, James radioed, planning to disconnect at 10 nautical miles. Copy that, Delta 473, Miller responded. We'll maintain position until your command, then execute immediate climbing turn to port to clear your approach path. The minutes ticked by. 12 nautical miles, 11, the runway growing more distinct with each passing moment. 10 nautical miles, Bill announced, altitude 5,800 feet. Reach 328, initiating disconnect, James radioed. Thank you for the assist. Good luck, Maverick, Miller replied. See you on the ground. Emily coordinated with the connection teams. All teams report ready for simultaneous release on my mark. 3, 2, 1, release. The 4 cables detached simultaneously from the Boeing 777. The C-130 immediately banked away, climbing rapidly to clear their approach path. James felt the aircraft respond differently without the stabilizing influence of the connection. Their descent rate increased immediately to 600 feet per minute, but they were close enough now. The runway was within reach. "Gear down," James ordered. "Configure for approach." Reynolds deployed the landing gear using the emergency gravity extension system. Without hydraulic pressure, the gear simply fell into position, locked by gravity and mechanical systems. "Gear down and locked," he confirmed. "5 green." James established their final approach path, aiming for the very beginning of the runway. Without flaps or slats, their approach speed would be significantly higher than normal. Without brakes or thrust reversers, their stopping distance would be dramatically increased. "Runway in sight," he announced, commencing final approach. The Boeing 777 descended steadily toward the foam-covered runway. Fire trucks and emergency vehicles lined both sides, their lights flashing against the stormy background. 4 nautical miles, Bill reported. Altitude 2,400 feet. James maintained absolute focus. This would be the most challenging landing of his career. A crippled wide-body jet with minimal control, no power, and no brakes. 3 nautical miles, 1,800 feet. Emily moved beside him again. "The runway is foamed for the first 5,000 feet. After that, there are arresting barriers at 1,000-foot intervals." James nodded. The foam would provide some initial deceleration. The barriers might snag the landing gear, further slowing their progress. But the outcome remained uncertain. 2 nautical miles, 1,200 feet. Reynolds keyed the cabin announcement system. "Cabin crew and passengers brace for landing. Brace, brace, brace." 1 nautical mile, 600 feet. James made final adjustments to their approach angle. Without flaps, the 777 wanted to float in ground effect. He would need to counter this tendency to ensure they touched down at the very beginning of the runway. 500 feet, 400, 300. The runway threshold passed beneath them. James held the aircraft just above the foam-covered surface, bleeding off airspeed. 200, 100, 50. With exquisite precision, he planted the main landing gear firmly on the runway exactly at the beginning of the foam section. The aircraft shuddered violently as the wheels contacted the surface. "Gear contact," Bill announced. "All trucks on the ground." Without thrust reversers or spoilers, the Boeing 777 continued rolling down the runway at high speed. James used the residual hydraulic pressure to maintain directional control, keeping the aircraft centered on the runway. "Speed 140 knots, Reynolds called out. "First arresting barrier approaching." The nose gear hit the first barriers designed to catch aircraft landing gear. The barrier stretched, creating drag, but the aircraft's momentum carried it through. "Speed 120 knots. Second barrier approaching." Each barrier slowed them further, but the end of the runway was still approaching too quickly. James fought to keep the aircraft straight as they hit barrier after barrier. "Speed 80 knots. Runway remaining 2,000 feet." It was going to be close. Too close. James made a split-second decision. Turning onto the overrun area, he announced, using the last of their hydraulic pressure to begin a gentle turn away from the end of the runway and onto the paved overrun area. The maneuver worked. The additional surface provided the extra distance they needed. The Boeing 777 finally rolled to a stop, its nose barely 50 feet from the grass beyond the overrun area. For a moment, perfect silence filled the cockpit. Then the sound of cheering erupted from the cabin. 240 passengers and crew alive against impossible odds. "Aircraft secured," James announced formally, following protocol even in this unprecedented situation. "Shutdown checklist." Reynolds began the procedure to secure the aircraft, while Bill contacted the emergency services now racing toward them. Emily stood silently beside James, watching as he finally released his death grip on the controls. His hands trembled slightly from exhaustion and fading adrenaline. "You did it," she said quietly. James shook his head. "We did it. All of us." She nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind his words. Then, to his surprise, she placed her hand briefly on his shoulder. "My father would have approved," she said, "of all of it." As emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft and evacuation procedures began, James Sullivan allowed himself a moment of reflection. 25 years ago, he had made a call that saved many lives at the cost of one. Today, through skilled determination and unprecedented cooperation, they had saved every soul on board Delta Flight 473. Some debts could never be repaid. Some wounds never fully healed. But perhaps, just perhaps, the universe occasionally offered a chance at redemption. Emily Davis was alive, the daughter of the man whose sacrifice had haunted James for decades. And in saving her and working alongside her to save everyone on that aircraft, James had found something he thought forever lost. The aftermath of an emergency landing always carries a peculiar silence, a moment suspended between catastrophe averted and reality resumed. As Delta Flight 473 sat motionless on the overrun area of NATO Faro Base's runway, that silence filled the cockpit for precisely 3 seconds before erupting into organized chaos. Emergency evacuation checklist. Captain Reynolds announced his training, taking over despite the overwhelming relief. James Sullivan nodded, hands still resting on the control column that had, against all odds, guided a crippled Boeing 777 to a safe landing. His muscles ached from the prolonged struggle against failing controls. His mind was still processing the impossible sequence of events that had brought them here. Evacuation not immediately necessary, Bill Harrison countered, scanning the external cameras. No fire, aircraft stable, emergency services approaching. Controlled disembarkation would be safer given the weather conditions. Outside sleet mixed with rain lashed against the windscreen. The Faroe Islands in November offered no comfort to potential evacuees. Reynolds considered the recommendation, then nodded. Agreed. We'll coordinate with ground crews for passenger disembarkation via mobile stairs. As Reynolds communicated with the approaching emergency vehicles, James finally released his grip on the controls. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the physical strain of flying a massive airliner with minimal hydraulic assistance for over an hour. Emily Davis stood beside him, her expression a complex mixture of emotions. That was, she seemed to search for the right word, unprecedented. James allowed himself a small smile. That's one way to put it. Bill clapped a hand on James's shoulder. In all my years flying experimental aircraft for the Air Force, I've never seen anything like it. The mid-air connection with the C-130, that'll be in aviation textbooks for decades. If anyone believes it happened, Reynolds added, returning to the conversation. Ground crews are positioning stairs now. They're prioritizing medical teams to assess injuries before beginning passenger disembarkation. James nodded, his professional demeanor returning as the immediate crisis faded. Any word on the saboteurs? Local security forces are standing by to take them into custody, Reynolds confirmed. NATO counterintelligence has been notified. Given the target and methodology, this is being treated as a major security incident. The cockpit door opened and the lead flight attendant appeared. Despite the ordeal, she maintained a professional composure that James silently admired. Captain, medical teams are boarding now. We have 12 passengers with minor injuries, primarily from turbulence before you took control. Nothing life-threatening. She paused, then added with unmistakable emotion, the passengers want to thank the flight deck crew, especially Colonel Sullivan. James shook his head. This was a team effort, from the flight deck to the cabin crew to the passengers who assisted. His eyes flickered briefly to Emily. Everyone played a part. Nevertheless, the flight attendant insisted, they know what you did, what all of you did. Word has spread about the mid-air connection, about flying without engines or hydraulics. They're calling it a miracle. Not a miracle, James corrected quietly. Just good training and better luck. Bill snorted. Always the modest one, Maverick, even after pulling off the impossible. A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the cockpit windows, they could see a military vehicle approaching, followed by what appeared to be a convoy of official cars. Looks like the welcoming committee, Bill observed dryly. Reynolds checked the communication panel. Base commander requesting permission to board, along with NATO officials. Better tidy up, Bill joked, gesturing to the organized chaos of the cockpit after their ordeal. James rose from the co-pilot's seat, wincing slightly as stiff muscles protested. He'd been so focused on flying the aircraft that he hadn't noticed the physical toll it had taken. Emily noticed his discomfort. You should get checked by the medical team. I'm fine, James assured her automatically, the standard response of a military pilot regardless of actual condition. Of course you are, she replied with knowing skepticism. Just like my father always was, even with 3 cracked ribs after a hard landing. The casual reference to her father without the weight of accusation caught James by surprise. Before he could respond, the sound of the main cabin door opening announced the arrival of the base officials. Minutes later, the cockpit was crowded with military and NATO personnel. A tall, distinguished officer in a Royal Air Force uniform introduced himself as Group Captain Edward Hamilton, Base Commander. Gentlemen, lady, he addressed them with crisp British formality. On behalf of NATO and the Royal Air Force, I extend our profound admiration for what you have accomplished today. When we received your initial mayday, followed by your unconventional request for C-130 assistance, I confess we thought it impossible. So did we, sir, Bill replied with characteristic bluntness. But Colonel Sullivan here has a habit of redefining impossible. Hamilton turned to James with newfound interest. Colonel Sullivan, the same Sullivan from Operation Blackwing. James nodded, unsurprised that a senior NATO officer would be familiar with the now declassified mission. Yes, sir. Remarkable, Hamilton murmured. And fitting somehow, Lieutenant Colonel Miller has already briefed me on the mid-air connection procedure. Absolutely unprecedented. We'll need detailed debriefings from all of you, of course. The saboteurs, James inquired, redirecting the conversation away from praise he felt undeserved. Hamilton's expression hardened. In custody, 4 individuals confirmed so far, including the one found attempting to access the electronics bay. Initial assessment confirms ties to the Vostok group as you suspected. Counterintelligence teams are processing them now. Emily stepped forward. They were targeting the NATO missile defense documents, and possibly the conference attendees. Hamilton nodded. That's our current assessment as well, Ms. Davis. Your actions in identifying and neutralizing the electronic devices likely prevented them from completing their mission. He paused, studying her more closely. Davis, any relation to Lieutenant Robert Davis of the Gulf War? His daughter, Emily confirmed quietly. Something passed across Hamilton's face: recognition, respect, perhaps even a touch of awe at the coincidence. Your father's sacrifice during Operation Blackwing is well known among NATO senior officers, Ms. Davis. It changed the course of the air campaign. Thank you, sir, Emily replied simply. Hamilton turned back to the broader group. We'll begin passenger disembarkation momentarily. Medical teams are standing by, as well as accommodation at the base for tonight. Commercial transport to London will be arranged for tomorrow, weather permitting. The NATO conference materials, Reynolds inquired. Secure, Hamilton assured him. Special courier transport is already being arranged. As the group captain continued outlining the immediate arrangements, James found himself watching Emily. The revelation of her identity to others, the acknowledgement of her father's sacrifice, he wondered how she was processing it all. Her composure was remarkable, but he recognized the subtle signs of emotional strain beneath the professional exterior. 20 minutes later, the passenger disembarkation was well underway. The flight deck crew had been asked to remain aboard temporarily to assist with technical assessments of the aircraft damage. James stood near the main cabin door, watching as passengers were escorted down the mobile stairs to waiting buses. Colonel Sullivan. James turned to find a young boy, perhaps 10 years old, looking up at him with unabashed admiration. Tommy insisted on thanking you personally, explained the woman beside him, presumably his mother. He watched everything from his window seat. Hasn't stopped talking about the amazing pilot since we landed. James knelt to eye level with the boy. Tommy, I appreciate that, but it wasn't just me. It was Captain Reynolds, Colonel Harrison, Ms. Davis, the brave flight attendants, and many others working together. Tommy nodded solemnly. Mom says you used to fly fighter jets, that you were in a war. That's right, James confirmed. Were you scared today? I mean, the question asked with a child's directness deserved an honest answer. Yes, James had admitted. Being scared is normal when things are dangerous. The trick isn't not being scared. It's doing what needs to be done anyway. Tommy considered this with surprising thoughtfulness. I was scared too, but when I saw the other plane, the military one, come to help us, I felt better. That's what we do, came a new voice. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Miller approached, still in his flight suit from the C-130. We help each other when things get tough. James stood, extending his hand to the man he hadn't seen in 25 years. Frank, good to see you in person. Miller clasped his hand firmly. Never thought our reunion would involve such unconventional flying maverick. He turned to Tommy with a wink. Colonel Sullivan here once saved my life and about 200 other guys back during Desert Storm. Guess I finally got to return the favor. Tommy's eyes widened. Wow, are you both going to be at the NATO meeting in London? Will you talk about what happened today? The innocent question caused a subtle shift in Miller's expression. That's classified information, young man, he said with exaggerated seriousness, then smiled. But between us, I think today's events might just make it into the discussion. As Tommy and his mother continued toward the exit, Miller turned back to James. 25 years, Maverick. Hard to believe. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, James admitted. Other times like another lifetime. Miller nodded in understanding. When I heard your voice on the radio, I couldn't believe it. The same pilot who made the tough call that saved our ground forces, now needing our help. He shook his head in wonderment, and using a technique that's never been attempted before. You always did have a flair for the unconventional. Necessary improvisation, James corrected. Call it what you want, Miller replied. My C-130 crew is still trying to process what we just pulled off. The flight engineers are already working on calculations to determine exactly how it worked. They're talking about developing formalized procedures based on today's operation. The Sullivan-Harrison maneuver, Bill suggested, joining the conversation, has a nice ring to it. The whole thing nearly gave my co-pilot a heart attack, Miller admitted with a grin. When I told him we were going to attempt to stabilize a Boeing 777 in flight, he thought I'd lost my mind. It was a near thing, James acknowledged. If your piloting hadn't been perfect, Miller waved away the compliment. That's the thing about impossible situations, Maverick. They bring out the best in those trained to handle them. His expression grew more serious. But that's not the only remarkable thing about today. I understand Robert Davis's daughter was on board. James nodded. Emily Davis, aerospace engineer. She was instrumental in identifying the threat and establishing the connection points for your cables. Life has a strange way of coming full circle, Miller observed quietly. Have you told her about the specifics of Blackwing, about her father's last moments? She knows the official version, James replied, the declassified report. But not everything, Miller surmised. James looked away. Some details weren't included in the official record. Maybe they should be, Miller suggested gently, for her sake, for yours. Before James could respond, a NATO security officer approached. Colonel Sullivan, the intelligence team requests your presence for an initial debriefing. The saboteurs have begun talking. Duty calls, James said to Miller. We'll catch up later. Count on it, Miller assured him. The base commander is hosting a dinner for the flight crew and rescue teams tonight. Consider yourself officially invited. As James followed the security officer toward the terminal building, his mind returned to Miller's suggestion. The classified details of Operation Blackwing. Robert Davis's final transmission. The words that had haunted James for 25 years. Words that Emily deserved to hear. The debriefing took place in a secure room within the NATO base's administration building. 4 intelligence officers, American, British, German, and Danish, led the session methodically, working through the events aboard Delta 473. The primary suspect has confirmed Vostok Group involvement, the American intelligence officer explained. Their mission was twofold: acquire the missile defense documents and eliminate key NATO personnel aboard the aircraft. The latter objective disguised as a tragic accident, the British officer added. A commercial airliner lost at sea due to catastrophic systems failure. How did they infiltrate the aircraft systems? James asked. Commercial aviation networks are supposedly isolated from external access. They didn't hack in remotely, the German officer clarified. They used physical devices planted by operatives posing as maintenance personnel during the aircraft's previous layover in Frankfurt. The devices were designed to create progressive systems failures that would appear to be cascading mechanical problems. Sophisticated, Bill commented, and patient. They must have been planning this for months. At least 6 months, according to preliminary intelligence, the Danish officer confirmed. The operation was meticulously planned. What they didn't anticipate was having 2 experienced military pilots on board who could recognize the attack patterns. Or Ms. Davis's intervention, James added. Her technical expertise was crucial in identifying and neutralizing the devices. The American officer nodded. Ms. Davis's contribution has been noted. Her security clearance is being temporarily elevated to allow full participation in the ongoing investigation. The debriefing continued for another hour, the intelligence officers extracting every detail of the sabotage and the crew's response. When they finally concluded, James felt mentally exhausted, in a way that even the physical strain of flying the crippled aircraft hadn't produced. "Colonel Sullivan," the British officer said as the others gathered their materials. "A word in private, if you don't mind." Once they were alone, the officer's formal demeanor softened slightly. "Sir, I've been authorized to inform you that Group Captain Hamilton has been in communication with USAF leadership regarding today's events. There will likely be formal recognition for your actions, possibly quite significant recognition." James shook his head. "That's unnecessary. I was just doing my job." "With respect, sir, flying a commercial airliner with no hydraulics connecting it mid-air to a C-130 and landing safely goes well beyond doing your job. It's the sort of thing that makes headlines and history." "The entire crew deserves recognition," James insisted. "Captain Reynolds, Colonel Harrison, Ms. Davis, the flight attendants who maintained order to the air, marshals who contained the saboteurs, everyone played a vital role. And they'll all receive appropriate acknowledgement," the officer assured him. "But the world loves a hero, Colonel, especially one with your background." James bristled slightly at the implication. "This isn't about public relations." "No, sir," the officer conceded, "but it is about morale, about showing the world that when faced with sophisticated threats, the good guys still win, that skill, courage, and ingenuity triumph over terrorism and sabotage." Put that way, James could understand the broader perspective. Still, the prospect of public attention made him deeply uncomfortable. Throughout his career, he had preferred to operate in the background. Even his most significant missions, including Operation Blackwing, had remained classified for years. "Is there anything else?" he asked, ready to conclude the conversation. "Just one thing, sir," the officer replied. "Ms. Davis has requested to speak with you privately. She's waiting in the officer's lounge down the hall." James felt a small tightening in his chest. "Thank you. I'll head there now." The officer's lounge was a modest space with comfortable seating and a view of the airfield. Through the windows, James could see Delta 473 still parked on the overrun area, now surrounded by technical crews who was assessing the damage. Beyond it, the C-130 that had performed the unprecedented mid-air connection sat on the apron, likewise undergoing inspection. Emily Davis stood by the window watching the same scene. She had changed from her travel clothes into borrowed NATO base attire, practical cargo pants, and a dark blue sweater with the base insignia. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, emphasizing the determined set of her jaw. Robert's jaw. "Ms. Davis," James said quietly, announcing his presence. She turned, offering a small smile. "Colonel Sullivan, thank you for coming." She gestured to a coffee service on a nearby table. "I took the liberty of ordering refreshments. You must be exhausted." "Thank you," James replied, pouring himself a cup. The normalcy of the action felt strangely discordant after the events of the past hours. They sat across from each other in comfortable armchairs, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the room. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of shared history and unspoken words hanging between them. "The intelligence officers tell me you've been granted temporary elevated clearance," James finally said. Emily nodded. "Given my involvement in identifying the electronic warfare devices and my existing security credentials, they felt it was appropriate." "They made the right call," James affirmed. "Your technical expertise was invaluable today." "That's actually what I wanted to discuss," Emily said, setting down her coffee cup. "Not today specifically, but expertise, technical knowledge, the things we know and the things we don't." James raised an eyebrow, uncertain where she was heading. "I've read the declassified report on Operation Blackwing," she continued. "Multiple times. I know the official account of what happened to my father. How his F-16 was struck by a surface-to-air missile. How you made the decision to continue the mission rather than abort to attempt a rescue." "Yes," James confirmed, his voice tight. "That's accurate." "But it's not complete," Emily stated. It wasn't a question. James studied her face, seeing not accusation, but a simple desire for truth. "No," he admitted, "it's not complete." "I'd like to hear the rest," she said simply. "The parts that didn't make it into the official record. I think I'm old enough now, and after today, I think I've earned it." James took a deep breath, weighing his response. The classified details of Operation Blackwing had remained sealed in his memory for 25 years. He had never shared them, not even with Bill, who had been his mentor, but not part of that mission. "You have earned it," he agreed finally, "but it's not easy to hear or to tell." A few important things are, Emily replied with quiet dignity. James nodded, gathering his thoughts. Then slowly he began to speak. January 17th, 1991. Four F-16's call signs Phoenix 1 through 4. I was Phoenix 1 mission commander. Your father was Phoenix 3. James paused, the memories crystallizing with surprising clarity. Our mission was to neutralize a previously unknown anti-aircraft installation deep in Iraqi territory, an installation that was decimating Allied air forces and preventing effective ground support. Emily nodded. This much was in the declassified record. What isn't widely known is that we had intelligence suggesting the installation was using a new Soviet-designed radar system, one that could potentially track our stealth aircraft. If true, it represented a significant escalation and a major threat to the entire air campaign. That wasn't in the report, Emily confirmed. No, it remained classified even after the rest was declassified. James took another breath. We were approximately 40 miles from the target when Iraqi MiG-29s ambushed us. They had been waiting using terrain masking to avoid our radar detection. James's voice became more measured as he recounted the engagement. Your father's aircraft was hit by an air-to-air missile, not a SAM as the report states. The MiG pilot made a textbook interception. Nothing your father could have done differently. Emily absorbed this revision to the official account. Why change that detail in the report? Politics, James replied simply. Acknowledging the effectiveness of Iraqi pilots flying Soviet aircraft didn't fit the preferred narrative after the war. It was easier to attribute losses to ground-based threats. Emily nodded in understanding. And after he was hit, here James paused, gathering himself for the most difficult part. His aircraft was severely damaged, but still flyable. He reported loss of most control systems, but believed he could maintain controlled flight long enough to reach friendly territory or at least the desert for bailout. But you continued the mission instead of escorting him, Emily stated again without accusation. Yes, James confirmed. Based on the intelligence about the radar installation, its continued operation would have resulted in dozens, possibly hundreds more Allied casualties. I made the call to split the formation. Phoenix 2 and 4 continued to the target with me. Phoenix 3, your father turned back toward friendly lines. Emily's gaze never wavered. What happened next? We completed the mission, destroyed the installation, confirmed later that it was indeed using the advanced radar system we had feared. The action likely saved hundreds of Allied lives in subsequent operations. And my father, James met her eyes directly. His last transmission came approximately 12 minutes after we separated. He reported multiple system failures, and that bailout was now his only option. His exact words were, James paused, then continued with perfect recall. Phoenix 1, this is 3. Aircraft no longer controllable. Proceeding with bailout over coordinates Tango Delta 59er. For what it's worth, Maverick, I'd have made the same call. Complete the mission. Tell Emily her daddy loves her. Phoenix 3 out. Emily's composure faltered for the first time. She looked away, blinking rapidly. Search and rescue was launched immediately, James continued softly. But the area was heavily contested. It took 3 days to reach the coordinates. By then there was evidence of his parachute, but no sign of your father. Intelligence later confirmed he had been captured by Iraqi forces shortly after landing. He died during interrogation, refusing to provide any information about the mission or the target. A tear slipped down Emily's cheek, but her voice remained steady. He knew the risks, as did my mother when she married him. Your father was one of the finest officers I ever served with. James said, his own emotion now evident. His sacrifice ensured the mission's success, and his last thoughts were of you. Emily nodded, taking a moment to compose herself. Thank you for telling me, for giving me the complete truth after all these years. You deserve to know, James replied simply. It's strange, Emily said after a pause. Growing up, I created so many versions of my father in my mind. The hero from my mother's stories, the smiling man from photographs, the ghost who wasn't there for birthdays and graduations. She looked directly at James. But today, flying with you, watching you make impossible decisions under pressure, staying calm when everything was falling apart, I think I finally understood him. Who he really was. The weight of her words settled on James like a physical presence. He would be incredibly proud of you, Emily. Your courage today, your technical expertise, your clear thinking under pressure, you're every bit his daughter. And more, came Bill Harrison's voice from the doorway. Sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help overhearing. Ms. Davis, your father was an exceptional pilot, but what you did today, identifying advanced electronic warfare devices, establishing connection points between aircraft and flight, all while keeping your cool in a cabin full of terrified passengers, that goes beyond anything he ever faced. Emily smiled at the unexpected compliment. Thank you, Colonel Harrison. Bill, please, he insisted, entering the room. After what we've been through today, formality seems a bit redundant. What brings you here, Bill? James asked. Base commander sent me to fetch you both, Bill explained. The dinner for flight and rescue crews is starting soon, and apparently there's to be some kind of impromptu ceremony beforehand. James groaned inwardly. Ceremony. Don't look so alarmed, Maverick, Bill teased. Just a small token of appreciation from grateful militaries. No press if that's what you're worried about. Small mercies, James muttered. Emily stood smoothing the borrowed NATO sweater. I should change into something more appropriate. You're fine as you are, Bill assured her. This isn't a formal military dinner, just a gathering of people who've shared an extraordinary experience. As they walked toward the officers' mess, James found himself reflecting on the day's improbable journey. From a routine flight to London, to a desperate battle against sabotage and physics, to a conversation 25 years overdue. Life's strange symmetry had brought Robert Davis's daughter into his path at precisely the moment when both could find a measure of closure. The officers' mess was crowded with personnel from multiple NATO countries. The flight crew of Delta 473, the C-130 crew that had performed the unprecedented mid-air connection-based personnel who had coordinated the emergency response, all gathered in a room humming with excited conversation. Group Captain Hamilton spotted them entering and approached immediately. Colonel Sullivan, Colonel Harrison, Ms. Davis, our guests of honor, please join me at the head table. As they made their way across the room, James noticed familiar faces. Captain Reynolds engaged in animated conversation with Frank Miller, the flight attendants who had maintained remarkable composure throughout the crisis. The air marshals who had helped contain the saboteurs. Before dinner is served, Hamilton announced once they were seated, we have a brief presentation. While formal recognition will undoubtedly follow through official channels, those of us gathered here tonight wish to express our immediate appreciation for the extraordinary actions taken aboard Delta Flight 473. An aide approached carrying a small wooden box. Hamilton opened it to reveal 4 medallions. These are NATO Meritorious Service Medals, he explained, rarely awarded to civilians and never before on the same day as the action being recognized. But today's circumstances are, to put it mildly, unprecedented. One by one, Hamilton presented the medallions to Captain Reynolds, Bill Harrison, James Sullivan, and Emily Davis. The room erupted in applause with each presentation. When James received his medallion, Hamilton leaned in close. This is just the beginning, Colonel. What you accomplished today will be studied in military and civilian aviation programs for generations. James accepted the medallion with appropriate gratitude, but his attention was drawn to Emily as she received hers. The look of quiet pride on her face, so reminiscent of her father, struck him deeply. After the presentations, dinner was served. The conversation flowed freely, the shared experience of danger and triumph creating bonds that transcended rank and nationality. James found himself recounting technical details of the differential thrust technique he had employed while Bill described the electronic warfare patterns they had identified. As the meal concluded, Frank Miller approached James's table. Maverick got a minute. James excused himself and followed Miller to a quieter corner of the room. Just got word from NATO headquarters, Miller said, his voice low. The documents we were protecting, the missile defense system plans, they're revolutionary, game-changing technology that could neutralize hypersonic threats. If the Vostok group had succeeded today, but they didn't, James reminded him. Thanks to you, Miller insisted, to all of you. He paused, then continued in a more personal tone. I've thought about Operation Blackwing many times over the years, about the call you made that saved our ground forces. I never had the chance to thank you properly. No thanks necessary, James replied automatically. Miller shook his head. There you go again, deflecting. Some things never change. He placed a hand on James's shoulder. I saw your face when you realized Emily Davis was Robert's daughter. I know that weight you've carried. Maybe today was the universe's way of balancing accounts. James considered this. Maybe, or maybe just blind chance. Either way, Miller said, you've done right by her father's memory. That counts for something. As Miller departed to rejoin his crew, James found himself looking across the room at Emily. She was engaged in conversation with a young RAF officer, her hands moving expressively as she apparently explained some technical aspect of the day's events. Despite everything she had learned about her father's fate, despite the danger she had faced, she displayed a resilience that was profoundly admirable. Bill appeared at his side following his gaze. She's something special, that one. Yes, James agreed. She is. You know, Bill said thoughtfully, the NATO missile defense program is always looking for top engineering talent with security clearance. And after today, her stock has risen considerably. James raised an eyebrow. Playing matchmaker, Bill? Not romantically, you old warhorse. Bill chuckled. Professionally. She's brilliant, brave, and now has practical experience with cutting-edge electronic warfare. Plus, she's Robert Davis's daughter. The symmetry is perfect. It's her decision, James pointed out. Of course, Bill agreed. But sometimes people need to know doors are open before they consider walking through them. The evening continued, the conversation gradually shifting from the immediate events of the day to broader topics. Plans for continuing to London the next day? The NATO conference that would now include first-hand accounts of the Vostok Group's attempted sabotage. The implications for aviation security going forward. As the gathering began to disperse, Emily approached James, who stood by a window overlooking the now dark airfield. In the distance, floodlights illuminated Delta 473 still being examined by technical teams. They say it will never fly again, she said following his gaze. Too much structural damage from the landing and the mid-air connection. Probably for the best, James replied. Some experiences leave marks that can't be repaired. Emily studied him thoughtfully. Are we still talking about the aircraft? James smiled faintly. Perhaps not. I've been offered a position, she said after a moment, with the NATO missile defense program, a significant promotion from my current role. They cited my exceptional performance under pressure and unique insights into counter-electronic warfare measures. Congratulations, James said sincerely. It's well-deserved. I haven't accepted yet, Emily clarified. It would mean relocating to Brussels, leaving behind the life I've built. Change is never easy, James acknowledged, but sometimes necessary for growth. Emily nodded, then asked unexpectedly, what will you do now, Colonel Sullivan? After all this, the question caught James off guard. He had been so focused on the immediate situation that he hadn't considered what came next. Return to his consulting work, continue the quiet retirement he had carved out for himself. I'm not sure, he admitted. Today has shifted things, perspectives. They offered you something too, didn't they? Emily guessed. James nodded. A position with the NATO Aviation Security Advisory Board, developing protocols for identifying and countering the kind of sabotage we face today. Will you take it? James looked out at the aircraft again, considering. For years I've kept to myself, consulted from a distance, avoided anything that might put me back in a position to make life or death decisions. He turned to face her directly. But today reminded me that sometimes those decisions find you whether you're prepared for them or not. And sometimes, Emily added softly, facing them is the only way forward. Their conversation was interrupted by Group Captain Hamilton approaching with an urgent expression. Colonel Sullivan, Ms. Davis, forgive the intrusion, but I've just received word from NATO headquarters. The conference in London has been moved up. Critical briefings will begin tomorrow afternoon, and your presence is specifically requested. Both of us? Emily asked, surprised. Yes, Hamilton confirmed. Your first-hand experience with the Vostok Group's electronic warfare capabilities is deemed essential intelligence. A military transport will depart for London at 0800 hours. As Hamilton provided additional details, James found himself studying Emily's reaction. The unexpected acceleration of events, the growing importance of her role, the subtle shift in how others perceived her, no longer just an aerospace engineer, but a key player in countering a sophisticated threat. When Hamilton departed, Emily turned back to James. It appears our paths will continue to cross at least for a little while longer. It appears so, James agreed. Good, she said simply. I have a feeling there's still more to learn. From you, from today's events, from all of it. As they prepared to leave the officers' mess, Bill joined them one last time. Quarters have been arranged for everyone on base tonight. You two should get some rest. Tomorrow promises to be another eventful day. Just hopefully with fewer mid-air emergencies, Emily quipped. Bill laughed. I'll drink to that. Outside, the night air was crisp and clear, the storm having passed during dinner. Stars shone with remarkable brightness over the Faroe Islands. James paused to look up at them, the same stars that had guided pilots for generations before GPS and inertial navigation systems. Beautiful, aren't they? Emily said, following his gaze. Eternal, James replied. No matter what changes on Earth, they remain constant. Reliable. Like certain people, Emily observed quietly. James looked at her, seeing in her face a reflection of her father's steady character, but also something uniquely her own. A brilliance, a determination, a future full of potential. Your father would be very proud of the woman you've become, he said, giving voice to the thought that had been with him throughout the day. I think, Emily replied thoughtfully, he would be proud of both of us, of what we accomplished together today. As they walked toward the base accommodations, James felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a burden carried for 25 years gradually lightening with each step forward. The impossible decisions of the past couldn't be undone. The lives lost couldn't be restored. But perhaps in saving 240 souls today, including Robert Davis's daughter, some measure of balance had been restored to the universe. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The NATO conference, debriefings about the Vostok group, decisions about future roles and responsibilities. But for tonight, it was enough to walk under the stars alive and unburdened with the daughter of a man whose sacrifice had never been forgotten. In the distance, Delta Flight 473 stood silhouetted against the floodlights, a damaged but undefeated giant. Like the human spirit, it had carried safely to ground against impossible odds. Broken perhaps, but unbroken in all the ways that truly mattered. Just like the man who had guided it home.